Okay, this is Buddha Vangsa.
And Dharma Vangsa.
And we're here at the Forest Monastery and want to do a little podcast on this book, The Buddha's Teaching and the Ambiguity of Existence by R.G.D.S. Wettimuni. Very interesting name. He's a Sri Lankan guy who studied Buddhism and was himself a writer and teacher when he met a monk by the name of Gnanavir. And Gnanavir was from England. And they had a correspondence back and forth because Wettimuni lived in Colombo and Gnanavir lived way up in the mountains in central Ceylon at that time, next to a bird sanctuary. And he lived like an early Buddhist monk begging for his meals at local villages. And he was a deep thinker, very, very thoughtful monk. And so his influence on Wettimuni led to this book, The Buddha's Teaching and the Ambiguity of Existence. Now, this phrase, ambiguity of existence, comes from existentialist philosophy. And the existentialists, of course, were the dominant philosophers of the 20th century. And really, nothing has come along since then to replace existentialism, and it remains pretty much the default background philosophy of the Western world. And of course, Western culture is going everywhere now, so you see its influence even here in Sri Lanka. But this existentialism was very significant because the existentialists asked questions that must be asked about the individual and the aim of existence. Well, what are we doing here? What are we anyway? Where are we going? What is the purpose of life? They asked all these great questions. And they came up with a way of looking at these questions called phenomenology. That, in other words, we are in a situation. The human being is not a separate entity from the rest of the world that he lives in. That's why Heidegger called his book Being in the World. So we are being in the world. We can't separate ourselves from our world. And we have certain questions about that. And those questions are very difficult to answer, like, who am I? As soon as we begin to answer this question, we come up against very great difficulties. And every philosopher has tried in his own way to overcome these difficulties. And the existentialists were the first ones to admit that these difficulties are insuperable. The questions cannot be answered. Yet, they must be asked. So, because of the existentialists, now the whole humanity is in a crisis, an existential crisis or an ontological crisis of meaning.
Because of Nietzsche.
Well, not only Nietzsche, but
he
summed it up.
Yeah.
God is dead.
God is dead.
For the many centuries previously, human beings got their meaning from religion. And that we're supposed to somehow or other serve God, this transcendent entity. And of course, that was misused for political purposes by various possessing beings to exploit others. And so in the 16th century, beginning in the 16th century, the so-called Enlightenment happened, which began to break away from the authority of the church and to question the teachings of the church. And this led to positivism, which we now know as science, or scientism. And it also led to various forms of philosophy culminating in existentialism, which tried to answer the question of the human existence in terms of our actual experience. This is something new. Until existentialism, all forms of philosophy, whether they were theological or not, tried to answer the question, the main questions of life, in reference to some outside source of authority, some scripture or some set of beliefs or some moral code that had existed previously.
You had mystics who went inside, but they were also leaning on an external authority for their systems.
Yeah, they weren't confronting the raw reality.
No.
They were going in with a preconceived idea. And so, of course, as a self-fulfilling prophecy, they got to see what they were thinking about. But that's not necessarily what was there. And they keep coming up against the same problems as the philosophers, that they wind up with an ambiguity. What's an ambiguity? An ambiguity is when we cannot precisely define the answer to a question.
It's unclear whether it's A or B, or C or D.
Yeah, it's unclear. It can't be resolved. The question can't be resolved because every attempt to answer the question leads to another question, and it's an infinite regress. For example, if we say, who created the world? Well, God created the world. But then the question is, who created God? If creation is necessary, if there's a beginning of things, then it becomes an impossible question to answer, because if A created B, then C created A, then D created C, and so on, back indefinitely. So these type of questions are questions that we must ask, along with who am I, what is the purpose of life, but that there is not necessarily a clear-cut answer for.
At least not by reflection.
No, not by thinking in the usual way. The usual way of thinking is that we think back on our experience, and we reflect on our memories and on things we've heard and read, discussions we've had, and so on, and we try to come up with answers in words.
But they're all from outside of ourselves.
Yes, not only that, the answer is not in the form of an experience. It's in the form of symbols.
Thinking aboutness.
Right. Another distinguishing characteristic of the existentialist is that they sought an experience. Because what can answer the question of human nature other than an experience of human nature that is different from the ordinary experience, beyond the ordinary experience, superior to the ordinary experience? So they were searching, although they couldn't really define that search, they were searching for another kind of experience. And they failed. And they admitted that they failed, which was a very courageous thing to do. Nietzsche, for example, went crazy. He had to be committed. Poor guy. He was the one who came up with the formula God is dead, meaning all the systems of authority that have existed up to this point are invalid. Okay? But he couldn't find anything to replace it. Now the funny thing is, the Buddha said the same thing 2,600 years ago. He said, there is no such thing as a self. Nothing can be found resembling a self or pertaining to a self, belonging to a self. And that includes the self of the universe, or God. Okay? So he didn't say there is no God, but he didn't say there is a God either. Why? Because the very question itself is invalid, just like the question of creation. It's an invalid question because it leads to an infinite regress. The Buddha then said, well, what are the right questions? And for that, he looked into experience. He looked into what is. He's very fond of saying, that's the way it is. And the way it is that there is suffering. That's the first noble truth. If there's suffering, there must be a cause of suffering. That's the second noble truth. And if there's a cause of suffering, then it must be possible to undo that cause, to end the suffering. That's the third noble truth. And then how to do that is the fourth noble truth. So Buddha not only perceived these questions, he realized them. In other words, in the form of an experience. Okay, so the Buddha's teaching is the answer to the questions raised by the existentialists that they were unable to answer.
First and foremost, the question of suffering.
Well, yes, but first you have to dispose of the other questions. What is I? What is being? What is existence? Right? How did things get like this? Why is the world the way it is? All those questions that you can think of very easily, but you can't answer very easily. And humanity has gotten hung up on a false trail. Science. Science tries to answer these questions by getting rid of the subject, by getting rid of the observer, and saying only the objective reality is actually real. But as we all know, we do exist. And so our existence is really the only thing that matters to us, in fact. So the scientists have made themselves increasingly irrelevant to the actual concerns of everyday life, because they've got themselves off in this objective. They painted themselves into a corner, really, is what they've done.
Yeah, and now they aren't even really measuring stuff in the objective world even.
Oh, with quantum mechanics and all that?
Yeah.
Oh, yeah, it's gotten so far out. It has nothing to do with the ordinary life. So to solve the problems of ordinary life, the real problems of life, we have to look to a different source. And that source is the teaching of the Buddha. Therefore, that is the title of the book. The Buddha's Teaching and the Ambiguity of Existence. So I was very happy to come across this book. And we're now in the process of looking for people who knew Wetimuni and Jnanavir and the other people involved in the scene that created this book. We're right here in Sri Lanka, so we're in a good position to search them out. But in the meantime, then we'll probably have some interviews with them and conversations with them. But until then, we're going to go through Wetimuni's book. I've already started to serialize the book on the blog, and the podcasts will more or less refer to the parts of the book in already serialized on the blog. But of course, we're going to have more discussion. And so there won't be an exact correspondence, but you can sort of follow along by reading along those serialized excerpts. Am I talking like a writer now?
No.
Oh, okay. When I start saying things like serialized excerpts.
Well, I'm getting used to it. So
oh, okay.
maybe the listeners have their consciousness somewhere else right now.
Dhammavansh has been working with me on this project for over a year now. And it's funny how we got here. We started off researching leadership because the spiritual organizations that I was affiliated with in the past failed. And we perceived that failure as a failure of leadership. So we started by researching the state of the art in leadership technology. And one thing led to another. We found that the source of the leadership technology being taught in the military academies and places like that, high-level executive conferences and stuff like that, the source of that material is the existentialists, the philosophers. So, of course, we skipped over the common public seminars, the commercial seminars and like that, and we went back to the source. We said, well, if they're getting their ideas from Heidegger, we should read Heidegger. So we started reading Heidegger, which is sort of like reading a brick wall. We're trying to climb a brick wall. And gradually we came to understand a lot of these ideas came from the teaching of the Buddha. So we said, well, let's skip over these existential philosophers and go back to the teaching of the Buddha. And that was when we really started hitting the pay dirt. That's when we really started getting solutions and benefits to our personal issues, as well as the questions that started the search in the first place. And gradually we're going to bring out all of that value that we've experienced on this quest. But you're just going to have to put up with us, because we have to discuss it in a systematic way, defining all the terms very carefully, so that you can actually get the idea. You can actually duplicate the concepts. Otherwise, it's going to be very difficult for you to apply the material.
No understanding even without duplication.
No, not real understanding, only superficial. So this may not appeal to the mass audience, popular audience. In fact, it almost certainly won't appeal. Because they want like a shrink-wrapped solution, and we don't have that. We have a do-it-yourself kit.
And they want to keep their ego. And
well,
we want to get rid of it.
Most of the solutions involving the Buddha's teaching available in the West are packaged for Western culture.
Manipulated, tampered with.
Yeah, well, I'm trying to be kind. You know, you go in a store sometimes in India, and it'll be wrapped in a really nice package. The product will be in a package, and it says for export only. It's like that. The Buddhism that you encounter in the West is completely different from the Buddhism in its countries of origin. And there's more than cultural reasons for that.
Yeah.
There's also philosophical reasons for it. And we're going to be getting into all of that. But Dhammavamsa was quite correct when he says that people want to keep their egos and we want to get rid of them. Because the ego is the problem.
Well, even Buddha Ghosh and Vishuddhimagga misunderstood this stuff, so it's maybe not so strange that the Westerners get it wrong.
It's not so strange. Misunderstanding is also here in the East. We see plenty of commercialized Buddhism or religious Buddhism, both of which embody the same type of misunderstandings. Buddhism, real Buddhism, the practice of Buddhism, is for the person who wants to solve their problems permanently. Not just make a better life, but overcome this business of being entirely. And that's a radical solution. But that is what is required to actually address the questions that the existentialists have raised. And the only other solution is suicide. And that's the way the human race is going right now. The human race is poised to commit suicide. And, you know, there's even a popular group called Suicide Girls.
Really?
Oh, yeah. Yeah. And they're making multimedia presentations and stuff. Why, you know? Who is that guy?
Nirvana, Kurt Cobain.
Kurt Cobain committed suicide. This is Nirvana? That he committed suicide? So there's a tremendous misunderstanding of both the questions and the answers that existentialism has raised. Actually, the existentialists have admitted they can't answer their questions. Some of them have tried, and I picked up this thread before and dropped it. Nietzsche tried with his idea of Superman. And, for example, Korzybski tried with his idea of abstractionism and the analysis of language and so on. He failed, right? Now it's degenerated into NLP, neuro-linguistic programming, and other behaviorist control freak Scientology and stuff like this. So these teachings have to be understood very carefully. They can easily be gotten wrong. And the penalty for getting the question or the answer wrong is that you don't get relief from suffering. So this is like, in one way, very serious business. But in another way, it's very joyful because it means the end of all the typical little problems that plague people in ordinary life. Those problems are all due to the existence of the self. And if you can overcome this compulsion to create a self, then most of the ordinary problems of life just vanish. They just evaporate. And then there's only left the really, really big problems, like reincarnation. Why do we have to get born again and stuff like that? And but those require a very high level of understanding to even comprehend. So we're going to be going through this book and gradually introducing the Buddha's teaching in the language and vocabulary of existentialism. And this is Weti Muni's and Gyanavir's great contribution, that they understood both sides. They understood the Buddha's teaching properly, and they understood the existentialist philosophers properly, and built a bridge. And we're going to be going over that bridge. And the toll of the bridge is you have to learn a certain language. You have to learn certain definitions. So we're going to be going into these definitions, and then after some time of that type of work, we'll be able to discuss the actual methods. So I hope you stay with us. This is fun for us. It helps us understand everything. And it should also help you. Anything more?
So this is for all the real philosophers of the West.
You have some friends that are phony philosophers.
Well, most philosophers are phony philosophers.
Yeah.
Because they don't look into the experience with fresh eyes. They always have some bias.
Like they want to get published? Or they want to get tenure?
Get along with the system.
Yeah. But we don't care about that. We want to solve the problems of life.
Yes.
So if you stay with us, hopefully you'll get some insight into those problems and their solutions.